Let's take a look at the idea of putting students on the spot. This is another area that I see some room for improvement when I go to seminars and when I see people training other people. And here's what I'm talking about. It all gets down to intimidation, but sometimes it's unintentional on the part of the instructor, but it happens nonetheless, and it's perceived as intimidating by the learners. Here's what happens. A professor or a teacher, instructor will have something they want to ask someone, and they will say, "Jane, tell me how to do an anchoring." Okay, that's one way of asking a question, and it's a legitimate way. It's a way that gets information. And if you have prepped everyone ahead of time and said, tomorrow I'm going to ask random questions of people, and I want you to be ready to answer, that's one thing. People are ready. But realize when people are at a seminar, they don't necessarily expect to master it until after the seminar, because they've got all this information coming at them, a lot of information, sometimes one thing after another. It's really a lot to process and master in the time of the seminar. A lot of it happens when it's able to gel afterwards. They've gone through this process, they go home, they look over their notes, they say, "Oh, okay, that's what they meant. Now that makes sense, and now I can tie it in with what they said before. Okay, I understand how everything fits together now." That's a process that usually requires them to get back home, look over things, and put the pieces together. What usually doesn't happen is complete mastery within the time of a seminar. So if you haven't prepped them in any way and you just say, "Jane, tell me how to do an anchoring," they're going to feel on the spot. So a better way to do it, in my opinion, as an educator, is to either tell them ahead of time, the day before, say, "I'm going to ask questions about these categories, A, B, and C, and I want you all to be able to answer in a concise way if I call on you, because I will be calling on random people and asking questions about A, B, and C." So you limit it to a certain body of knowledge, you prep them ahead of time, and if they're not prepared, that's not your fault, that's their fault. That's one way to ask questions properly. Then you can just fire away. "Jane, tell me how to do an anchoring," and it's fine. Another way to lessen the blow a little bit and to avoid intimidating learners is to bring up the question beforehand. And the way you do that is to say something like this. Rather than saying, "Jane, tell me how to anchor," you say something such as, "Let's talk about anchoring." Now, anchoring is very crucial in NLP, and of course you remember the steps to anchoring, and everyone remembers the steps to anchoring, is that right? Okay, and then some people are looking through their notes saying, "Oh, okay, yes, I'm nodding my head, but no, I don't remember the steps to anchoring," so they're looking through it. They have a preparation. They know you're talking about anchoring. Then you can fire off your question. "Okay, well, I'd like to call on someone and ask them to tell me about anchoring. I'm just going to pick someone. Before I do that, though, remember that such and such is due tomorrow," so you're prepping them. They've got a little bit of time now to scramble and put it together if they don't have the answer. And you're talking about other things that need to be covered anyway, but it's really just time that they can use to look for the answer. And then you fire off the answer. "Okay, Jane, please tell me how to do an anchoring." Okay? So there's a big difference in prepping someone and then asking them and just asking them cold. Because when you ask them cold, you set yourself up as that type of teacher. And I had this type of teacher in Latin 1 at the University of Florida. I had 3 semesters of Latin, and Latin 1, the teacher, who was a graduate student, apparently had had a drill sergeant as his Latin teacher, and he was interested in putting everyone on the spot. So in Latin, there are a lot of things to memorize. That's, at least in Latin 1, that's all it is. You just memorize this and that and the other thing. And so he would ask you to break down a word in the different forms that the word can come in, and he would just go around the room and fire off. And you never knew which word you were going to get until he pointed to you and called on you. That didn't help me at all. I got an A in the class, but it was not thanks to that. It was not thanks to this angst that was created in the moment, because actually when he called on me in class, when he called on other people in class, the answer wasn't fully correct. the answer wasn't brought out in a correct way in many of the cases in the class. But when it came time for the test, I was able to produce the answer in the correct way. This gets down to the idea of teachers putting intimidation above learning. If your goal is to intimidate learners, and sometimes teachers do this with the intention of using it as a teaching tool, but if you're really after getting the student to feel intimidated, more so than getting them to learn, then this technique's great, because that's what it causes. It causes intimidation. But if you really want to work with the learner and get them to learn, then you preface things and you give them some prep time. And if you've given them 24 hours of prep time, you told them you're going to ask about these 3 things, like if that had happened in Latin, for example, and we're told we're going to be asked about these 3 things, then we would have been ready for that. But as it turns out, it's really not the best approach. What it does is it sets up just a feeling of not feeling that great. It sets up a feeling of the student who's already in a vulnerable spot to feel even more vulnerable and to feel intimidated. So I want you to avoid that.